Hey, everybody. You'll notice I'm in a different part of the studio complex here. Normally, I'm here with the guitars and the Marshall as the backdrop. I thought I'd try this other corner. It has some benefits, including the fact that I have an Ethernet connection here. My internet has been wonky, so I apologize ahead of time if I drop off. Stick with me. I'll be back in 20 seconds if that happens. But it's good to see everybody. Looks like we got a good crowd already. We expect it to go up as this show goes on. Lots to cover here about the war in Ukraine. There have been a lot of developments in recent weeks. But first, let me go through a little bit of admin. If you're not already a subscriber, click the button, ring the bell, and become one so you don't miss anything. Because we're talking Ukraine, I got my Slava Ukraini t-shirt on. Remember, the drive is to support the Return Alive Foundation. We've supported them since the outset of the invasion, basically last March, raised upwards of $25,000. So if you go to the episode description and click on the merch link, the Teespring link, you can find these t-shirts in my store. And as I said, and mugs too. We got cool mugs that have the same logo. So check that out and appreciate your support there. It's been really heartening. And I know that the Ukraine military appreciates what we've done so far, but it's not over yet. So if X equals expertise on the war in Ukraine, of course, we turn to my good friend, Justin Bronk. Justin, you have been doing a world tour and it continues. So where have you been lately and where are you going in the near future?
Well, I've been to Germany and Sweden recently. I'm off to Canada tomorrow, and the rest of the month includes Poland, America, Germany, Finland. So yeah, it's getting busy, but always good to see the world.
Yes, and you're coming to DC a few weeks from now, so we'll actually get to meet face to face. We'll have a transatlantic summit that we've always dreamed of in DC. So we'll look forward to that, and I'm sure we'll be able to do something live, some quickie Starbucks live tweet or something. I don't know, but looking forward to seeing you in DC in a few weeks. So let's start by setting it up with a little bit of audio visual here. I have a few videos of stuff happening, and then I'll let you comment on this on the backside. So the first thing is this tweet that shows an Su-30 getting shot down, and it claims that the aviators punch out, but I can't see it. So let's watch that for starters here. So do we know what kind of weapon that was that hit that guy?
So that guy, I think the claim is that it was a Stinger. I mean, Manpad certainly. What's quite interesting is we've seen a significant increase in the Russian aircraft loss rate over the past month or so. So following the retreat in Kharkiv, they've pushed back. Obviously, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back first to the Oskil River, where they tried to reestablish a defensive line. And then the Ukrainians have managed to cross the river as well as push further south in the sort of upper reaches of Donetsk Oblast and towards the south of Luhansk Oblast, culminating in the successful encirclement of Lyman and the push forward, which is still going on. The Russians have failed to reestablish a usable, defensible line up in the north there. But interestingly, since that, the sort of initial stunning collapse on the Kharkiv axis, the VKS has become more active again. They seem to be, someone seems to have told them that they need to throw in everything they can. Although it's worth stating that it's still a relatively limited sortie rate compared to earlier on in the war. But we've seen an increase in attacks by VKS aircraft and indeed Ukrainian aircraft in frontline areas. And as expected, a lot of those attacks have been pretty inaccurate. Only the Sukhoi 34 fleet are still really attacking with any regularity with precision-guided munitions, mostly KH-29Ts and Ls, so TV or laser-guided standoff missiles with a standoff range of about 15 kilometers. Can push it a bit more depending on altitude. But the Ukrainians moved up with SA-11, SA-8, and potentially also NASAMs being fielded in small numbers. I don't know if they're closer to the front lines or not. Most long-range Ukrainian air defense has been held back, covering the cities from cruise missiles. But suffice it to say, the Russians have generally had to stay low, and with most of their fleets not particularly used to employing precision-guided munitions, when we did see some precision-guided munition use from the fighter fleets, the Su-30 and 35s earlier in the war, it was generally satellite-guided CAB 500 or 1,500 class weapons, so useful against fixed targets, but not against battlefield targets. As a result, when they are trying to do this kind of low-level interdiction or close air support to try and help stabilize the lines as the Ukrainians are breaking through both in the south and the north, they're having to fly low to visually ID targets. They're having to come in and conduct bombing runs and rocket runs. Interestingly, more unguided bombs are being dropped recently by both sides. We're seeing more footage of bombing runs rather than standoff rocket toss attacks, although that continues. And so consequently, we've seen this uptick in Russian fixed-wing losses, at least 4 in the past couple of weeks. A couple of Sukhoi 34s, a Sukhoi 30, and something unknown, I think. Also seeing some really interesting bombing footage from the Ukrainians. If you'd said a few months ago, well, certainly a year ago, that the Ukrainians 6 or 7 months into a war with Russia would be using Sukhoi 24s to conduct retarded, unguided bomb deliveries in Russian-controlled airspace against Russian aircraft on the Russian side of the lines, I'd have thought you were certifiable.
Well, that because you and I did a live stream about the time that the battle shifted to the east, and we were talking about how close air support was going to be ineffective, but we were talking about the Russian use of close air support. We didn't even account for the idea that the Ukrainians might mount some close air support, and so it's almost like the tables have turned.
They have. Clearly the AGM-88 HARM supplies have had an effect in opening up the frontline areas more to Ukrainian aircraft. They're also using the TB2 UAVs again, mostly apparently in a sort of target designation role, particularly now that Ukraine has so many more modern howitzers that are capable of precision fires, plus things like HIMARS. The TB2 is probably more useful and more survivable in a target designation capacity. They can stand off much further. They don't have to get close enough to launch MAM-L or MAM-C munitions themselves. But also we're seeing these low-level bombing runs and rocket attacks by Sukhoi 24 and 25s on the Ukrainian side. That the actual hard kill rate for AGM-88 is probably pretty low. They have hit some Russian SAM radars, but the majority of the effect is most likely the fact that because the Ukrainians are firing HARM in significant numbers, the Russians are having to be much more cautious about when they illuminate their SAM radars, illuminating for much less of the time. When they do illuminate, if they try and conduct engagements, doing so for much shorter time periods, and much as the Ukrainians have had to do for most of the war, because the Russians have been firing KH-31Ps their way. So that will have significantly reduced the effectiveness of Russian SAM cover close to the line. And so if you fly very low, like the Ukrainians have been doing, then you have a measure of protection against the really long-range SAMs due to the radar horizon. Also the fact that Ukrainian medium-range surface-to-air missiles, the SA-11s, have been able, it seems, to get close to the front lines in most of the fighting areas, probably because the Ukrainians are in the ascendancy in terms of the artillery battle in some areas. That's forcing the Russians to fly low again. So their fighter caps, which were a significant problem for the Ukrainians, particularly in Donbass between April and late June, early July, when the Russians had that kind of local air superiority and were able to mount medium and high altitude fighter caps close to the line, that was providing a significant look down, shoot down threat against the Ukrainians, forcing them to stay further back, even at very low level. That seems not to be the case so much anymore. Certainly a lot of footage suggesting the Ukrainians are being more aggressive with their close air support. On the other hand, it is worth remembering that on both sides, by Western measures, this is very ineffective close air support. Despite the bravery of the pilots, unguided weapon attacks at very low level with very, very short target acquisition and difficult aiming parameters because you're only doing one pass. That is not going to give you the sort of results we associate with close air support as we think of it over the past 2 decades from Western perspective, with targeting pods and PGMs used at medium and high altitude. So this is still overwhelmingly an artillery war and an artillery battle.
So let me get another highlight reel here that proves out what you were talking about about the Russians coming in low. Here's a couple of Su-25s, and again we'll comment on the backside of this short video. So belay my last, that was not a Su-25, obviously, it was a flanker. The caption was incorrect. The one guy was hit. I believe he returned at least to friendly country, if not home base, and then the other guy was shot down, obviously. So do we know what picked off that guy and damaged the other guy?
So significant engine fire, clearly. It's a Sukhoi 34. You can tell by the enlarged tail stinger with the rearward-facing radar and additional countermeasures compared to sort of fighter-optimized flankers. So the suggestion going around that could have been a bird strike, but also just as easily could have been a Manpads or even AAA. So localized damage. Only one engine is on fire. The aircraft is still under power. I would expect that it was probably hit at a slightly lower altitude and then climbed up. That's still higher than you'd expect to see under normal circumstances near the front line from both sides. So probably was hit or suffered a bird strike and a catastrophic flameout. Climbed up, so they had more chance of survival if they had to punch out, and then tried to turn back and fly back over their own lines. As I understand it, that aircraft did go down, but it seemed to have gone down, if not over the Russian lines, close to at least. Probably a shoot down, if we're honest. Bird strike is possible. Certainly an engine flame out. Either way, the Russians are down another really expensive multi-role fighter. They also had a crash at, I think it was Milorevo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but one of their air bases, they had a Su-25 stall in and crash on takeoff.
Yeah, so I've got that footage. In fact, wonderful segue. So here's the footage of that. It's from a tweet by the Ukrainians. So let's watch that real quick. Yeah, so a section go, looks like the guy just stalled the airplane. The -2 stalled the airplane and crashed. It's kind of basic. And I don't know if this is a commentary on we're now getting deeper in the bench in terms of talent. You can't imagine a veteran pilot would do that. You really can't. That's a simple nugget move, or somebody in flight school that just stalls the airplane on climb out. So I don't know if we have any background on what happened there, but it just looks like he stalled the airplane.
Yeah, so it's definitely a wing drop stall. There have been some suggesting that either he had a double engine flame, potentially had a double engine, either compressor stall or flame out of some sort, because one can see a significant change. basically as he's kind of starting to bank, the smoke trails disappear visibly from the engines. I'm slightly skeptical that it was an engine failure, because having a simultaneous double engine failure that quickly would be slightly odd, and also I wouldn't necessarily expect it to take place as he'd already kind of had a bit of PIO, so pilot-induced oscillation. He'd already risen in a slightly odd fashion, number two. So I think basically what seems to have happened is he got a bit high, either hit a bump or whatever, had a control issue, got a bit high, and then realized that number one had peeled off left already, sort of overcorrected to try and follow around with a reasonably heavily loaded aircraft, although not overloaded. I mean, it was only a couple of S-13 rocket pods and a couple of tanks, plus presumably full internal fuel. So Su-25 can carry a lot more than that. But so I think he overbanked, and at the same time probably as he overbanked, realized he overbanked, pulled the power back, hence the loss of smoke, the visible power setting change, because the smoke disappears. So even though he should have put the power on, I think what happened, best as I can work out, is as he overbanked, realized he'd overbanked, saw the ground coming up in front of him, and instinctively, went to a mental block of, oh God, I want more time before I hit the ground. So pulled back on the throttle, hence the engine cut just as the overbank starts. And then obviously at that point accentuated the wing stall and went in. Best I can tell. But the thing that it just says to me is, even if this wasn't a complete novice, it probably wasn't, but it may have been one of their guys who wasn't as good, but it certainly would be symptomatic of an Air Force that's been flown too long, too hard. This is either mechanical failure, massive fatigue, or both. This is someone making a slew of basic mistakes that when you add them together, Swiss cheese, I think theory is one name for that phenomenon, where a bunch of individual circumstantial or small circumstances or small mistakes that on their own don't cause a problem, but when they all line up together, cause a major issue. But it would make sense, given that the Su-25 fleet, they upgraded, I think, 84 of them to Su-25 SM standard, and then they upgraded another 24 to SM3, which you can recognize because they have the Vitebsk EW pods on the wings permanently. But that's not a big fleet, and they've lost 25 at least of them, so they're already down probably about 25 to 30% of the fleet, probably 50% of their usable fleet. And they're the mainstay of the ground attack sorties, and the Air Force is being constantly called upon to do more because it's not being effective. So it would make sense that in that scenario, the Su-25 fleet has been basically flown ragged. They would be having mechanical issues. The aircraft are probably overdue for their 50-hour checks, their 100-hour checks, 200-hour checks, all of that stuff. You would expect things to be starting to go wrong at this point, but also just pilots to be knackered, especially given that, if you're flying the rate there that small ground attack fleet is flying, that would be knackering for anybody. I mean, you'll know yourself, long deployments, you fly a lot, it gets very tiring, and that's when you're not being shot at and flying almost everything at 50 feet.
Right, right. Yeah, I was going to say, I'll bet you morale in the ready rooms is, a problem now. It could just be interpersonal relationships between flight lead and wingman, kind of a thing. Those, like you said, it's it's additive. In aviation safety, we talk about breaking a chain of events. That's why we call them mishaps and not accidents, right? There's no acts of God. There's no things that can't be stopped along the way. And I think that's sage to bring up that this is probably a function of all of these things together, that this guy's tired, morale sucks, maintenance malpractice, airplanes are high time, there's a malaise that's set in. Here goes another mission that's going to be either high risk for me, we're going to fly into a SAM envelope or a man-pad envelope, and if I get shot down, I'm not going to do well. And this other sort of thing about the reason we're here, kind of insidious creep that is definitely, and that's the other part of what we'll talk about here in a bit in terms of the macro situation. So let's look by the numbers here real quick. Got a couple of box scores. So here is a Excel spreadsheet, kind of a thing. and it's in reverse date order from day 183 up to day 212, which is the 24th of September. You can see that, as you were mentioning, the 15th particularly was a great day for them. 4 airplanes bagged in that day, and they tweeted this on the 24th. Today is a good day for Ukrainian Army, a bad day for Russian aviation. Su-25, 2 Su-30s, a Su-34 have gone down to fill in the blanks themselves, right? So, as we've noted, their use of social media is pretty effective. So there's the box score for that one day. The other thing, and we will dispute this, here's what they put out in terms of Russia's losses from the Kyiv Independent, which isn't exactly independent, right? So we'll note 265 planes, 228 helicopters. By the trade press sort of accounting, the number of planes might be 55. So there's a pretty large disparity between what we can document based on either B-roll or other news reporting that actually saw the airplane get hit and go down, and this number. What do you think that disparity is about?
So, I mean, just up front, the Ukrainian numbers are massively overstated, as are the Russian ones, of course. The disparity between the Ukrainian claims on Russian soldiers KIA or wounded in action and Russian vehicles destroyed is not enormous. I mean, there is a disparity, but in terms of the figures that one hears discussed among Western intelligence agencies, for example, that they're not orders of magnitude difference. The air domain is so. The basic trade-off here is that in the early days, Ukraine really needed it was critical both internally and for external support that Ukraine was seen to be doing extremely well. And so you had a huge overstating of successes, particularly when things were really desperate to begin with. And, you fed into things like the ghost of Kiev and all of that rubbish. So, as all countries do when they're faced with an existential war, there was an attempt to create national myths and push things forward. The actual numbers are fairly impressive in terms of confirmed Russian air losses. I mean, they're at 60 now. In terms of visually PID'd losses, or ones where there is absolute confirmation. Oryx continues to do good work on that, so you can go and look up each individual one. It's probably not the full total, so you could easily see another maybe 10-15% on top of that, maybe even a little bit higher, because there are no doubt aircraft that have gone down in Russian-controlled territory, and so the wrecks haven't been found or confirmed. And we've seen a few of those crop up since, for example, Kharkiv Oblast was taken back. We've seen a couple of wrecks that were previously thought to have been shot down, one or two that weren't known, that had been claimed but were kind of part of these numbers that aren't very realistic. That kind of added to the totals that we know about, and there are no doubt others. So 60 is the kind of verifiable number, and that suggests the real number is probably somewhere in the region of 75 to 85 in terms of things that have gone down without verification that the Ukrainians haven't, in territory the Ukrainians either haven't taken back yet or in Russian territory that we don't know about. But it's not going to be orders of magnitude different, because most shootdowns of Russian aircraft have occurred over Ukrainian controlled territory. And when an aeroplane goes down, people tend to film it, because it's over a combat area. Some have gone down in very, very remote wooded areas, but that's relatively unusual, because generally these aircraft are brought down when attacking troop concentrations. And if you see an aircraft on fire and going down in a war where everybody has a camera, it's relatively uncommon, particularly these days when a lot of the air ops are concentrated around the front lines themselves, to have losses that are completely undocumented. So of those sort of 60 to 75 to 80 in practice, but 60 verified, about 12 or 13 have been destroyed or damaged on the ground. So at Saki Air Base, in the Toshka U strike earlier on into an airbase in I think it was Belgorod Oblast. So, given how conservative the Russians have been with the use of their combat aircraft, that's still a very impressive tally. It's a testament to the effectiveness of Ukrainian air defense, particularly ground-based air defense, but also the fighters, particularly working together when they have done. But on the other hand, it's not 265 or whatever the Ukrainian claim is. But having started, as countries always do, with quite inflated claims when they're trying to win the battle of the narrative and establish confidence internally and confidence among external supporters, you can see how, from a public relations point of view, it's difficult for them to then revise those estimates down. Do you know what I mean? Sorry, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I got to be quick with the unmute there. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's propaganda 101, isn't it? So 4 or 5 things have happened in rapid succession, starting with this advance, this in the Northeast. Let me roll this B-roll. This is a Strela missile system that's rolling through the Donbass. It's kind of interesting to see the damage and also these guys on this vehicle. So let me roll that, and then we'll talk about the advance and what's real and what's maybe an illusion about it on the backside of just this video. Hold on. So obviously a lot of damage. It didn't look like any building was untouched. I think they went over some railroad tracks there, if I saw that correctly. Those look to be torn up. So talk to us about this taking of Lyman and what that means strategically.
So there's a few things in there. I mean, the as you rightly say, the destruction is very visually striking, and it's just a reminder of the human cost of it. Right, that every single one of those is somebody's home. That sort of level of destruction is pretty commonplace in terms of the areas that are being fought over, because, as I said, this is an artillery war first and foremost, and particularly in Donbass, where, if you look at the areas around Bakhmut, there are little sections of the front line. Russia, pushed Ukraine temporarily out of a little bit of the front line around Bakhmut earlier today or yesterday. That had changed hands for the 20th time, and then were repulsed because they couldn't hold it, and the Ukrainians are now back in control of it as that position. And so, where you have in Donbass in particular these areas which have been fought back and forth over for months, and both sides are so reliant on artillery, clearly you get that sort of devastation. It's going to take an enormous amount of work to rebuild, and an enormous amount of external support. In terms of Lyman, I mean, it's really significant for a few reasons. So from a kind of macro campaign perspective, it's a logistics hub, just as Izum was. So it kind of unhinges a significant part of the Russian kind of position in Luhansk Oblast, as well as it actually unhinges, having mentioned Bakhmut, it unhinges one of the key supply routes down to Bakhmut. So it largely renders pointless the sort of incremental grinding progress that Russian units down there, particularly Wagner units, have been continuing to make at great cost to both sides over the past several weeks, even since the fall of Izum and the Kharkiv Oblast. So those are essentially fairly untenable at this point. Hasn't stopped them trying and continuing to take losses they can't afford. This being the Russians. It's significant in the terms of the local position, local situation, because once again, it's a significant retreat of Russian concentrated forces from a fortified position. which is very, very damaging for morale. It also means they have to leave behind a lot of their heavy equipment and their supplies, which the Ukrainians will now benefit from as well. And it means that some of those units which may have retreated from Kharkiv, for example, may have retreated for the third time in 7-8 months. So you can imagine what it would do to your morale if you were a soldier who had fought on the Kiev axis, perhaps down towards Chernihiv, had to be seen defeat and had to retreat there in April. Then re-established for concentrated in Izium for attacks down into Donetsk. And then had to retreat from there recently, and then moved to fortify the line at Lyman, and then having to retreat from there. You can imagine what that would do to your morale. It also means the Russians once again are struggling to try and find a defensible line, having basically lost the Oskil River at this point, and also now Lyman as well, which was kind of the other side of the gap that they needed to hold between the Oskil River and Lyman. It's very significant politically because it comes the day after the sham referendum results were announced. They don't even. It's kind of hilarious to that the Russians don't even try to make it look potentially feasible. I mean, clearly they're falsifying the results anyway, and all the people going around in the propaganda videos to collect votes were, surrounded by Chechens with machine guns banging on people's doors and forcing them to tick a box at gunpoint. You think, well, you're not even trying there. But then to also say that the results were 93 or 97% kind of thing across the board, they're not even trying to make it look semi-feasible. But having announced that the day before, and if you look at the treaty texts that have been sent around the 4 oblasts that Russia is claiming as its own now, so Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk, the legal status of those oblasts in Russian law has actually already changed. They're not waiting for the ratification by the Duma, the Russian parliament. So what that means is that in Russian law, not only is it a reverse the day after this big announcement and ridiculous straight up fascist flag waving party thing that they had, parade and party thing they had in Moscow, to then lose a city the next day. But it's also, in Russian law, means that they've just lost a Russian city because they just made it a Russian city. So now a Russian city has been lost to a foreign army for the first time, presumably since the Second World War. So politically, it's really bad for Putin, and there's been a really, really interesting reaction across the Russian propaganda channel and kind of social media spectrum of kind of a mix of bombastic, right, the gloves completely have to come off now. Now's the time to send in all the new super weapons and armatas and whatever else that we've apparently been, they've convinced themselves that they've been withholding. And now we need to sort of take on the whole West. And you think, well, with what? Mixed with extreme kind of depression. I mean, you see the body language of some of the hosts who are a little bit more, even some of the normally manic ones, who kind of look physically depressed. I mean, they're sort of slouched and saying, clearly looking for people to blame, and having interviews with the former Southern Military District Commander, for example, saying, I cannot explain this militarily. It was interesting. He's basically said there must have been lies from the whole top to bottom of the system, and military orders and reality don't get perceived from the bottom to the top. They go from the top down. And at that point, his Skype connection cut. Now, maybe that's just timing, but it's really interesting that it was kind of, it probably was just cut because he was getting a bit too close to
let's watch. I've got a snippet from a talk show that backs up your point. So let's watch this, and then we can comment further on the backside of this snippet.
Не помню прецедент вообще в мировой истории, когда в состав государства принимались территории, которые мы не контролируем. Здесь так вот легко вы, Андрей, сказали, значит, Запорожская область,
я сказал, я цитировал.
Когда мы целиком ее
оставили. Это сказали в Запорожье, по-моему, это Владимир Рогов говорил, что после того, как оставшиеся территории будут освобождены, там тоже будет проведен.
После того, как оставшиеся территории будут освобождены. Очень тяжело спорить с мечтателями, которые живут вот в таком своем мире, когда будут освобождены. Но я вижу динамику развития боевых действий сейчас на фронте. Но мы не говорим про то, что происходит вокруг Лимана. Не будем говорить. Но, тем не менее, сейчас просто диковато рассуждать, как мы освободим Запорожье, 710 тысяч жителей, когда мы еще не знаем толком, честно говоря, положа руку на сердце, вот любой из нас, выйдя в гримерку, я думаю, признает, что он не знает, поможет ли мобилизация или нет нам переломить ход боевых действий. Пока все складывается не очень хорошо. Легко говорить, после освобождения Запорожья, вы попробуйте освободить его, учитывая, как все складывается.
So I'm kind of getting the other guy's expressions are like, hey, have fun in the gulag, comrade, with this outspoken thing. But that's
Don't
pretty
go
amazing.
near any windows.
It's pretty amazing and I don't know who that guy is particularly. I don't know if you know who he is. But that seems, to your point, to be some dissension when normally it wouldn't happen.
Yeah. I mean, he mentioned the mobilization. Interesting that there's been massive controversy about the mobilization, the way it's been conducted, even among the absolute most senior members of the Russian propaganda machine, because they can't hide it from the Russian people that they were taking people straight off the street from the universities. They were taking people with huge health problems, taking old people, taking just people at random, because as is normal in a system where orders seldom come right from the top down to the lower reaches, and when they do, there's an urge to kind of meet the quotas. Local officials and local military officers were just trying to meet their quotas and exceed them, so they were just taking people at random. One of the parts of the bargain, the grand bargain that Putin made with the Russian people when he came to power, was that he would make Russia a great country in terms of being a great power, crucially, not a great society. After the 1990s, Russians have mostly psychologically accepted that they can't be a great society, which is deeply sad. But I've had a lot of Russian colleagues and friends who've told me that over the years. From the 1990s, direct quote from one of them: after the 1990s, we accepted that we couldn't be a great society, so we vote for leaders who tell us we can be a great power. But the deal is that he will make Russia a great power, and the people can get on with their lives undisturbed. And the sort of unspoken bit of the deal is that they won't then question how someone who was never paid better officially than a colonel in the FSB can have giant palaces and be one of the richest men on earth. That's also part of the deal. And so this mobilization really breaks it, because suddenly people are being directly yanked out of their lives. And, amazing that you've seen going from a few weeks ago before the mobilization, where people saying war on the Russian talk shows and things were not, they were normally having to sort of caveat it by saying, of course, the special military operation, and now you have really leading members of the commentariat. Is it Sokolov or Sokolov? I can't pronounce his name. And the head of RT saying, I don't want to be sent to the meat grinder. Take the unemployed off the street and send them. Why should I? I don't want my son to go and die. And but using terms like meat grinder, it showed it's the sort of slipping of the mask that shows that they really do understand how badly it's going for them.
So I'm old enough to remember Vietnam, and this dynamic class warfare. Terms like meat grinder are very reminiscent of late 60s, early 70s public sentiment about Vietnam in the face of a draft. I remember, I was in 6th and 7th grade, older brothers of some of my classmates in middle school. Some of them went to Canada. It's like, what happened to Jimmy? It's like, oh, you won't see him for a while. This was an existential problem for American families that we don't know about this, but this is what you're seeing in Russia. I recognize this very much. And I would like to suggest that it's the beginning of the end in terms of their involvement, or it certainly erodes their ability, even Putin's ability to fight this war, right? So as we're say, okay, things that happen in rapid succession: the Lyman offensive, followed by the annexation of those 4 oblasts, followed by the limited mobilization of 300,000 Russians. And then all of this sort of, as you point out, that if you make that sovereign Russian territory and then you lose it, it's like, is that what you wanted? Those are unintended consequences of this move. And I saw on the news today that they all have their hands in Moscow and everybody's cheering Russia, Russia, Russia. I mean, this can't be good for Putin's standing, and not to mention we're always, every time we're on the show together, we're like, okay, what is Putin's off ramp? In general, we're like, well, Putin doesn't take off ramps,
Well, it's also difficult to offer him one because, well, politically he wouldn't take. I mean, well, they have started signaling that they're ready for peace talks, although the terms are always key there. But of course they're ready for peace talks in some respects because the Ukrainians are winning and the Russians are in a terrible position. It's not to say that something couldn't still go badly wrong over time, but it's worth remembering that at this point, a peace deal literally, unless the terms of the deal are Russian troops leave Ukrainian territory, including all 4 oblasts and Crimea, which, because at this point, the Ukrainians have a genuine shot at taking them back. And also, of course, as we've said before, I remember saying, a few months ago when we were having these chats, saying, remember Bucha, the massacres at Bucha and the torture and the mass rape and all of this, they are systemic. They are happening everywhere. And unfortunately, we've seen, for example, at Izium, after it's taken, we've seen mass graves with hundreds of people in the forests unearthed, all with evidence of violent deaths, many with evidence of torture. We've seen mass rape evidence coming out from all over the place. And this is completely systemic. So again, why would the Ukrainians accept, when they are militarily in the ascendant, giving the Russians an off-ramp that allows them to hold any more Ukrainian territory? And the Russians aren't going to accept an off-ramp, particularly after announcing this annexation, that involves them retreating from the territory they still hold. So a peace agreement that would be forced in would probably only harm the Ukrainians at this stage. Although that said, of course, they are continuing to suffer hugely. They are taking really significant casualties despite the success they're having, particularly down south in Kherson, where the territory is very open. It's very flat, wide, big fields. And so even if you're not out in the middle of the fields moving, once an enemy knows that either side is there, they kind of know to target the hedgerows because that's where people must be. So it's a very, very difficult place to make large maneuvers in, although as this map shows, the Ukrainians seem to have had some amazing success breaking through past Zolota Balka down towards Dochany in the last kind of 24 hours, which is fantastic, although it does mean that they're now within artillery range of Russian artillery on the east bank of the Dnipro River. So, there are issues. Russian artillery is mostly concentrated on the east bank at that point around there, because it's easier for them to supply it with ammunition without having to get it across the pontoon ferries because the bridges have been taken out with HIMARS. But it's much more of a meat grinder down in Kherson, which makes it all the more interesting that the Ukrainians have broken through significantly in the past 24 hours, because if the Russian position does start to implode in Kherson, that's kind of their last concentration of serious forces in Ukraine. They put all their elite units that still functioned in Kherson to forestall the well-telegraphed Ukrainian counteroffensive there, which is why the rest of the line is so scarcely manned in terms of not having reserve formations to block breakthroughs when they happen elsewhere. But of course, that means that if the Ukrainians do manage to grind down the Russian units in the Kherson pocket on the west bank of the Dnipro to the point that they break, that would be completely catastrophic for the remaining Russian military position in Ukraine, because they don't. That's the bulk of their remaining decent forces that are there and are having to fight a really, really unequal battle, because the Ukrainians, by telegraphing the offensive for so long, forced the Russians to fight in a militarily indefensible position long term, but that politically had to be defended because Kherson couldn't be lost as far as the Russians are concerned. It's the only major city they took without leveling it, in terms of leveling it to the ground, because it was very, very, very sparsely defended at the beginning. And so, Putin has basically said, well, it has to be, said that it had to be defended. But of course, that means that those units that had all been pushed in across the bridges, the couple of crossing points at Novokakovka and at Kherson itself, the Antonovsky Bridge, I think it is, which then the Ukrainians have been systemically hitting with HIMARS, so that the Russians have to move all their artillery and all their other supplies across pontoon bridges and ferries, which are themselves easy to spot and are regularly hit with HIMARS as well. The Russians are fighting that's a very attritional fight, whereas the movements in the north have been more attempts at maneuver warfare, as we would see it, to trying to take large-scale territory. The offensive in the south around Kherson is about destroying the remaining bulk of the Russian army in Ukraine by forcing it to fight in a place that politically has to be defended but is militarily almost impossible to sustainably hold. Interestingly, also, though, around Lyman, just to finish off up there, the other significant thing about it as an indicator is that unlike the Kharkiv breakthrough, which essentially was where the Ukrainian mobile mechanized units found a weak spot and punched through, and then rapidly pushed in reinforcements and kept driving to exploit and turn that into a rout by taking the lines of communication. In Lyman, what's basically happened is that it was a hard-fought battle over a significant period of time against troops that were reasonably well supplied, reasonably well positioned in a defended area, and they have successfully forced their way through the lines to encircle it and force those troops in that key defensive position to retreat. So it's the outmaneuvering, but slowly over time in a much more contested sense, and then surrounding and partial destruction of a Russian strong point, rather than exploiting a weak point in the line and then using that to kind of unhinge a large section of the front. So it's not to say that it's better or worse, it's that it is evidence that the Ukrainians can qualitatively outmaneuver, outfight, and ultimately attrit even quite strong Russian positions, rather than just having to exploit weak ones, even in the north.
So among the folks that it looks like there's a turning of the tide in terms of attitudes are some folks who are inner circle people. And, here's Evgeny Prigozhin, who is the financier of the Wagner Group, which is the, as we mentioned in the last episode I did, the last live stream I did with David Axe, the Wagner Group is basically fighting the war in the south. And that's why they're kind of holding the territory. Those guys are good. And then Kadyrov, who is a Chechen, who's a huge fan of Putin. And so this is a segue into the discussion about the use of nukes, because the first guy to use the N-word was Kadyrov. And then that was taken up by Putin. And obviously the response from the UN, and particularly from the Biden administration, was swift and unflinching with respect to, it's sort of a little bit cryptic, the catastrophic consequences. So let's talk about what is the Russian military's capability with respect to tactical nukes. What form do these take? And where would both literally and figuratively, the pieces go in the event that they were to use tactical nukes in theater?
Yeah, so the Russian military does have, by far, the most capable and varied tactical nuclear arsenal in the world. They have continued to invest in it heavily in a way that other countries just haven't done. The US really hasn't invested much in tactical nuclear capability besides the B-61 Mod 12 program, so that the in effect JDAMization of the freefall tactical nuclear weapon, the B-61, giving it a precision capability that it didn't have before, and life refreshing a lot of the components and updating them. And so, it's not something that the West has thought a huge amount about in terms of how we manage the escalation chains and how we look at the dynamics there. The Russians have continued to keep a nuclear capability, at least in theory, on a huge number of their weapon systems. So even some of their large air-to-air missiles and things are potentially nuclear capable, as well as depth charges and all sorts of crazy things. So in terms of what is nuclear capable, well, all of the Russian armed services have various nuclear capable weapon systems, most of which would be tactical nuclear weapon class. So typically you'd think tactical nuclear weapons are from the sub-kiloton, so less than 1,000 tons of TNT equivalent, up to somewhere in the region of 30 kilotons. And for context, Hiroshima was somewhere between about 10 and 13 kilotons, and Nagasaki somewhere close to 15. So in the middle of what we would consider tactical nuclear territory at the moment. When you see things like nuclear artillery or the Davy Crockett, which was a nuclear recoilless rifle that the US Army briefly experimented with, those are generally sub kiloton weapons that were being played around with. So I guess that from the Russian standpoint, they've got ballistic missiles that can deliver them. They've got so the Iskander series, for example. They have, and Tochka can also, in Russian service, deliver nuclear weapons theoretically. They have a bunch of cruise missiles, air-launched, potentially ground-fired. They tend to air-launched or maritime launch. So Caliber, Club, KH. So 101, I believe, is the conventional version. The low RCS cruise missile, and the KH 102 is the nuke. But so a lot of Russian weapons are dual capable in terms of long-range precision strike weapons. So they have a lot of options in that sense. The thing to bear in mind is that, at least from my perspective, is that there's only a few kind of potential ways to look at nuclear use as a possibility. So the first is as a signaling device. So basically try and spook the Ukrainians into backing down and accepting some sort of negotiation that preserves some of the current Russian gains, or spook the West into forcing Ukraine to do that. I think a detonation which didn't cause massive material damage. So, some people have suggested things like a detonation of the Black Sea, or an atmospheric nuclear test up in Russia's testing ranges, so breaking the nuclear test ban treaty. Those are unlikely to. So the Ukrainians have already said that they're not interested. They completely ignore it. Whether the West would respond, I think they'd more than likely have to double down on support rather than back down, and remind Putin more openly that NATO is also nuclear armed. It's quite funny that bit of the debate never really surfaces in Russian kind of propaganda, in the channels where people like Kadyrov or some of the Russian propagandists on TV are sort of talking about, well, we should use nuclear weapons. Some of the propagandists on TV have been saying things like, they really like the phrase, for some reason, reducing the UK to a Martian desert in 3 minutes. It's a weirdly colourful phrase. The former Russian ambassador even said on Radio 5, I think it was, so one of our standard BBC news channels, radio channels, he said in an interview that citizens in London should be concerned by the fact that if the war against Russia doesn't stop, then London would, there's nothing to stop Russia from turning London into a nuclear wasteland or something. And you think, well, we've got our own independent nuclear deterrent, which, conspiracy theories aside, doesn't require anything other than British authorization to use. The missiles are serviced in the US, but launch authorization, all the rest.
Well, so to that point, Justin, so if, and this is obviously completely hypothetical, we're not trying to be escalatory or alarmist here. That's not what we do. So if Putin was to use, or inadvertently one of the commanders in the field used one of the weapons you just outlined in eastern Ukraine, do we respond in kind, or do we double down conventionally? What happens?
So it would depend very, very strongly on where and what. Right. So the first use case was, sorry, I went down a rabbit hole, but was kind of outlining was the demonstrative use. So we use one, but we don't, as the Russian, we use one, but we don't. We use it in a place where it doesn't cause mass casualties, hope that the symbol alone is enough. I think that's unlikely because it wouldn't deter the Ukrainians, and I think the West would be forced to double down rather than back down because of what it would do if they did back down, in terms of long-term consequences, not only in Europe, but also for China, of course, who is watching all Chinese strategists as well as Western ones are watching this very, very closely in terms of what it will, what the precedents are and what Western behaviors are, as well as what Russian behaviors are. The second use case would be a battlefield nuclear use. So using a tactical nuclear weapon, people have been saying, well, we use, the Russians might use nukes to change the situation on the battlefield. This kind of wonder weapon that the Russian commentators keep reaching for. Well, we could escalate our way out of this. And the essential problem with that is tactical nuclear weapons are actually not as big as we think. So when people think of nuclear weapons, non-specialists anyway, they generally think of kind of apocalyptically gigantic fireballs that vaporize cities in the blink of an eye, which is accurate enough for megaton range strategic nuclear weapons. The problem with those are, first of all, some people in the business call them etch-a-sketch. Like it's just wiping the slate, because also not only are most of those sort of weapon systems heavy enough that to go into the megaton range, that they would be mounted on strategic systems that are very closely monitored by both sides, early warning and nuclear command and control systems. So the escalation dynamics would be really difficult. For example, from a submarine launched ballistic missile or an intercontinental ballistic missile, there you're getting into really difficult crisis management and escalation modeling scenarios that the Russians can't possibly control. If you're looking at smaller weapons delivered by things like an Iskander or yes, theoretically they could be dialed up quite high, but if you're looking at typical battlefield tactical nuke sizes between a sub-kiloton and up to about 30, so definitely kind of Hiroshima or Nagasaki scale weapons. If you actually model the blast size, I just as a thought experiment to Lyman and modeled a 10 kiloton blast, which is low end of Hiroshima, and the breaking all the windows kind of blast radius doesn't really quite clear the outskirts of the town, and this is a small town. And the actual fireball is confined to a small couple of blocks, and this is from an optimal airburst. So in that scenario, if you were being really cold-hearted about it, you could say, well, it's a catastrophe for the company it's dropped on, but it's not going to do a huge amount beyond the immediate vicinity. So people a couple of kilometers away are going to be potentially, if someone's looking directly at it, they'll be blinded. But the actual size of these things in tactical nuclear terms is not gigantic. It's not what we think of when we think of nuclear weapons. Because of the Cold War, and because of in the Cold War, you were talking about hundreds or thousands of thermonuclear megaton range weapons, which, that would be etch-a-sketch territory. And so the upshot is that a single one or two battlefield nuclear weapons used in Ukraine wouldn't change the overall balance of forces. So it wouldn't have a decisive effect in that sense. It would carry all the costs of breaking the nuclear taboo. So unpredictable escalation implications, which we can go into in terms of conventional or other responses. It would alienate China, which Russia is now utterly dependent on economically from here on out. They've made that decision whether they know it or not. But also militarily dependent on in terms of their ability to reconstitute their military after this, and they'll have to because they have no choice. They've burned all their ways of competing in terms of soft power, economic power, or ability to buy up other people's infrastructure and all that stuff and fund political parties. That's gone. So they'll have to rebuild their military, and the only place they're going to be able to get the components and a lot of the stuff is from China. So they probably don't want, there's a high cost to alienating China completely by breaking the nuclear taboo, especially after Xi Jinping very clearly stated, and Putin had to openly acknowledge that they disapprove of Russia's actions in Ukraine already. Same with the Indians. India has been kind of tacitly trying to not particularly condemn Russia. They rely on Russia a lot for support for a lot of their weapon systems, including the kind of linchpin of their air force, the Sukhoi 30 MKI. They kind of looking to maybe decouple a bit now, but that's going to take a long time. So India's been quite cautious to avoid overtly going against Russia in public. That would probably that would have to change realistically if Russia broke the nuclear taboo. And in terms of fallout, radioactive fallout, we don't have a huge amount of modeling data in terms of use in a relatively humid, overgrown, in terms of relatively verdant or lush area, because most tests took place either in the frozen north or in deserts or in small islets in the Pacific. A lot would depend on burst height and then whether it rained immediately into the cloud, either through creating its own condensation and rain out, as happened at Nagasaki, or just because it was already very, very rainy or bad weather. That would greatly increase the fallout compared to a high altitude airburst, which would be optimal for destruction up front. But if it didn't rain out, then you actually get very little fallout. But either way, the fallout, if there is some, will contaminate Russian areas as well as Ukraine and potentially further afield. And if you use lots of them to try and materially change the balance of forces, then A, the escalation dynamics go way off the chart, and B, you have an issue about, well, what happens if some of them don't work? Russia has trashed its conventional credibility in terms of as a military. It's going to take them a long time to get any of that back. So all they have left as a military bargaining chip against the West and potentially the Chinese, interestingly, is their nuclear arsenal. Now, if they use it and it doesn't create a strategically decisive effect, they've just fatally undermined the utility or perceived utility of their one remaining credible card they have to play. Especially if they try and use lots of tactical nuclear weapons that probably haven't had the same funding in terms of modernization and upkeep as their strategic nuclear arsenal has over the past 15 years. And of course, the more you use, the more the fallout is, and the more the escalation dynamics, both in terms of you're contaminating Russian-speaking areas and parts of Russia itself, as well as Ukraine, potentially contaminating Europe. What does that do to the right to retaliate and self-defense, which would then be potentially bringing NATO in directly, and NATO might come in directly anyway in that sort of scenario. And then the only third option is kind of nuking Kyiv or another major city with a large weapon, which carries all the costs with the guarantee that Russia is a pariah state forever, and also doesn't change the military balance of forces at all, and probably would ensure the utter motivation of every person on the front line to push Russia out. So yeah, I don't see a practical, logical argument for Russian nuclear use. That said, there wasn't a logical argument for Russia to invade Ukraine the way it did in February. So it doesn't say that they necessarily won't do it. It's just when people talk about them as well, if they are immoral or crazy enough to pass this threshold, then they could turn the battlefield situation around by going nuclear. That's not true. It wouldn't. You'd have to use so many that you would be straight into massive fallout problems, including for Russia, and the total irradiation of all the areas that they're trying to annex. So yeah, I don't really see it. But that said, yeah,
like
can't predict it 100%.
At Chernobyl, the fallout flowed east, right? I mean, the jet stream in Eastern Europe is like, that's global, right? That it goes west to east. Am I correct there?
Actually, I think the prevailing wind is west, but okay. Prevailing wind changes day to day. It's not predictable.
Yeah. So just thinking, to your point, if you use tactical nukes in Eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, the other separatist regions, and all of that fallout flows into sovereign Russia, that that's not a good way to make the nation happy about your actions. So I've been asked to, comment on this on XM Radio and some other things lately. My sense is, in the event that they use whatever number of tactical nukes, and I agree with you, this is highly unlikely, but if they would, what happens is that triggers Article 5 because of what you're saying about the potential for fallout going into a NATO signatory. So it is, in essence, an attack on a NATO nation. But I think what you have instantly is sort of a Desert Storm, Iraq invaded Kuwait scenario, where we're not going to respond with nukes against sovereign Russia. What we're going to do is have a full mobilization of NATO to retake, and I'm including Crimea and every bit of the separatist oblasts, to reconstitute sovereign Ukraine. And I think that would be the move in the event that Putin uses tactical nukes in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly interesting the degree of both overt official warnings from the Biden administration and other European heads of state that any nuclear use by Russia in Ukraine or elsewhere, except probably presumably in a test range somewhere, would trigger a very different form of consequences in terms of direct intervention. And so, we saw General Petraeus, or former General Petraeus, for example, essentially saying that any nuclear use would lead to the US military going in and essentially destroying any Russian military targets they can identify within Ukraine, which would be most of them. Now, that would take time to spin up, and there would be really, really dangerous escalation dynamics around that. But also remember, the West, and particularly the US, but also the West more generally, are not limited to that sort of relatively horizontal escalation. Russia has interests all over the world, including, for example, the Wagner Group in Mali, its forces in Syria, its Kaliningrad enclave, which is now deeply, deeply depleted of soldiers. They're down to reportedly around 6,000 soldiers, having stripped out a lot of their forces to feed into Ukraine, again, giving the lie to the argument that it was ever about NATO. They don't feel threatened by NATO. They're happy to pull forces out of their NATO-facing front lines and enclaves to reinforce Ukraine. But of course, that actually gives a lot of attack space, and also, we could do quite a lot to go after the Russian regime itself in terms of its standing internally. There's a lot more documents and evidence about how and where they keep their money, where they got it. There's a lot of stuff that could be done that has not been done. And also things like, which has already been discussed, I think, after the annexation, for example, Russian assets which have been frozen. Well, how about actively confiscating them and giving them to Ukrainians? Or to fund, the purchasing of more Ukrainian arms. In other words, while the Russian commentariat has moved to this position of saying, we are at war with the West, we're at war with the whole West, you almost want to laugh from an analytical point of view and go, you're doing this badly against Ukraine supplied by the West. You don't even want to find out how you would do against the actual West. Because you only have to look at anything in any Western country other than Ukraine, which arguably is, you can argue whether it's Western, certainly European. But if you go around any capital in or any city in Europe, we are not at war. People are going about their lives completely as normal. And so while there's been quite a lot of financial and military aid, there's been no mobilization. There's been no sacrifice in living standards. There's been, there's the discussion about whether politically the level of aid can be sustained with the squeeze on cost of living, etc. But there hasn't been any call on individual populaces within the West to suffer for Ukraine. And so, that should give you an idea of quite how little, in fact, the West has actually mobilized for this. I think there's very, very strong incentives for the Russians not to go nuclear. The problem for them is they really have no good options at this stage. And, if you look at the mobilization, it's comical in places. These guys, many of whom are old and have, obvious health problems, out in fields with no winter clothing and no food or anything, with being given rusty gear. But we shouldn't be under the impression that that's the whole picture. In a lot of cases, the problems are being fixed quite quickly in terms of that sort of issue. And, there's famous photos that were going around of some guys who've been given rusted up AKs. That was fixed within a couple of hours. That was just one crate that the water got into over the years that have been stashed. They will fix a lot of those problems, but the core problem for them is it takes about 6 months to make a conscript into someone who's combat ready in a very supporting role, not in a leading role, and to make formed units that are capable of serious action with semi-competent officers or NCOs. That takes a year minimum. And that's if you have a training infrastructure and adequate equipment to train people on from the get-go. What the Russians have is that they've got no instructors, or very few, and very few officers, because they've stripped them all to go to Ukraine. And the ones who haven't been killed, remembering that they've suffered massive casualties. I mean, there was about a month and a half ago now that a leaked Russian Ministry of Finance document suggesting that they have paid out. So just the ones they've seen fit to pay out on. Remember that, for example, the conscripts on the Moskva never got a payout. On 48,000 plus KIA in terms of compensation. And it's, the real number is probably closer to 55 or 60 at this point, especially since they've had the collapse of an entire front since then. So, the losses are huge. Plus, you'd expect at least that many, probably twice as many wounded, at least as many seriously wounded, and then maybe twice as many, including small wounds or captured. That's a huge manpower drain. But the ones who are still alive, they can't pull them out of the front line to go train new guys, because they're desperately short of manpower across the front lines. So if they try and pull, let alone good officers or good NCOs, to go and be instructors, to kind of make something out of this mass of mobilized people, then the front line will completely collapse. So the very fact that the pressure that has forced them to do this thing that they really didn't want to do, which is partial mobilization, the very pressure that forced them to do that is also the reason why it won't work, even if they give it more time, because they don't have the instructors or the formed units, the mass of competent people already to actually build a new army corps around that. And so what they're actually doing is feeding a lot of these guys in with a couple of days training or a couple of weeks, which is just cannon fodder and is going to probably make the situation worse on the front line rather than better. I mean, can you imagine the if you're one of the relatively elite units that are still fighting some of the airborne formations or Guards, Tank Army or Wagner, getting a load of people with literally no training who are furious, who don't want to be there with crap equipment, en masse, you'd probably be the thing that made you finally throw it all in,
Well, I mean, again, the analogy with Vietnam,
yeah.
right? That's the movie Platoon, right?
Right.
I mean, that's the Oliver Stone narrative, right?
Yeah.
And that's not an effective way to fight.
No. Well, and notable that, for example, the US has started supplying a different kind of HIMARS rounds, which are the non-unitary ones, the HE frag ones, that are designed for killing people in the open rather than hitting hardened things, which is not necessarily what you want if you're trying to go after infrastructure, but it would be really handy if you're trying to go after large amounts of poorly trained, poorly equipped infantry in the open in winter. So yeah, I mean, the Russian military position is really, really dangerous. The only hope they have at the moment is to try and throw in enough poorly trained people to create a bit of mass across the frontline areas that aren't being directly attacked, so that there may be fewer obvious weak points, and try and stabilize enough to stop the Ukrainians advancing unchecked before the winter weather shuts things down for both sides for the most part in November. So in that sense, the limitation in the north is probably the Ukrainians' ability to keep up the momentum without exposing themselves to massive losses. They've taken quite serious casualties because most of the people they're trying to fight with have also only been mobilized in February. So they haven't had years of training. They're very motivated. And in some cases, they have decent equipment. But the state of affairs in equipment terms is very varied between Ukrainian units. Not just in terms of Western kit, but also Russian or Ukrainian supplied stuff. And so, yeah, and especially down in Kherson, where, if they get caught in the open, both sides will get thwacked, and that goes equally for the Ukrainians. So, yeah, it's probably the Ukrainians' limitations in terms of exploiting the Russian position that will determine the limits on how far they can go before really winter stops major movements. But that said, even if the Ukrainians don't take back massively more before winter, they've inflicted stunning levels of attrition, and now those poorly trained people with not great equipment are being thrown into a system in crisis as winter comes on, to spend months freezing with poor supplies, being shelled in a country that they don't want to be in. Doesn't sound like a recipe for success.
No, absolutely not. You framed it just right here. The other thing we'll remind people when we talk about winter, the invasion started on February 23rd, 24th timeframe, right? So I think winter buys you, when you say winter, what you mean is the muddy season, not the frozen season, but the muddy season. So that buys you a month or so, maybe 6 weeks. The last topic to discuss in terms of current events with respect to responses to the idea that you're losing, and we'll note from the outset that it's this Nordstrom pipeline. So as soon as that was discovered by the Danish, and it was like a Richter 2 reading, everybody started pointing fingers. And the Russians were quick to say it was the Americans, and the Americans were quick to say that it was the Russians, and went to the UN and protested. So the breaking news is both of the pipelines that were ruptured are now fixed, according to the Danish. But this is, again, Putin denies causing these breakages in these pipelines. So we have no way to know whether they did it or not. We can talk about who has the most to gain, or who is most likely to have done this and for what. But is it not likely that, absent the ability to gain militarily with a conventional army, that you would resort to sort of, let's call it global terrorism like this, to just disrupt world markets and cause general havoc?
Yeah, so I mean, the things I would tentatively throw in would be, first of all, the Russians are desperate and are probably trying to pull every lever they can in the hope that something works in terms of changing the direction of travel, because the direction of travel is them losing and losing badly. The wholesale gas price had been stabilized and was falling in Europe when this bombing took place. So incentives would be who benefits from the gas price potentially going up again. And that had been causing significant political concern in Europe and elsewhere. So potentially there's an incentive for the Russians there and a disincentive for the West. Russia has a very capable fleet of specialist deep water submarines, which, among other things, like going after messing with undersea cables and things. And the West is very vulnerable to disruption of undersea cables. So from a signaling point of view, doing this against their own infrastructure where they can claim deniability, while also further disrupting energy markets and sending a signal to the West of, remember, we can mess with your subsurface underwater infrastructure, like all of those buried undersea cables and gas pipelines that your economies depend on going into winter. Makes sense as a signal, I guess, from the Russians' point of view. From an incentive side of things, it makes perfect sense that the Russians would potentially do it. I don't think it's particularly logical in terms of timing, that it doesn't really gain them a huge amount. But the direction of travel on European gas dependence had already been set. We're moving away from it as fast as we can. So, in terms of the people who would say, oh, well, the West wants to shut down, or America wants to shut down Nord Stream. Well, yeah, we did want to shut down Nord Stream, specifically the approval of Nord Stream 2, because it further enhanced European dependence on Russian gas and therefore vulnerability to energy blackmail. But that was pre-invasion, and that had already been shut down in the sense that Nord Stream 2 is not going ahead. And in terms of Nord Stream 1, we want to move away from it, but we don't want to freeze before we do because winter's coming on. So from a Western point of view, we would have preferred that pipeline stay fully operational going through the winter and then fully wean off next year. So, yeah, incentives-wise, the Russians have by far the most to gain, and they also have a well-developed fleet of underwater research vessels that can do things at great depth. So yeah, that's what I would throw in on that.
So, my ringtone is "Welcome to the Jungle" because I'm a rock and roller. So, sorry that I should have sanitized, as we say. Justin, it's always fantastic to have you on the channel. We look forward to seeing you here in the States in a few weeks. Until then, safe travels. And we'll look forward to having you on the channel again very soon.
Good stuff. Take care.
All right. So for Justin and Ward, we thank everybody for attending. We've had a huge crowd. The chat has been very lively. As soon as we sign off, this will be an episode on the channel. So check it out if you missed your comment or if you'd like to add some going forward. Until then, for Justin and Ward, we look forward to talking to you again very soon.